It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this event at the kind invitation of the National Electoral Institute in Mexico, which has been so kind as to invite people who are interested in the electoral world from different countries to participate at this type of event. We'll also have the possibility of hearing from, or rather having colleagues from Africa joining us today. So it's great to be able to see that this is one more event organized by the INE. My name is Joseph Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, and I will be the moderator during this event. I have a very lengthy institutional friendship with the National Electoral Institute of Mexico. To start this fourth session of this permanent seminar on democracy and elections throughout the world, I would like to first grant the floor to the president of the Council of the National Electoral Institute in Mexico, Dr. Lorenzo Córdoba Villanelo. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much, Joseph. It's wonderful to have you here with us today in this session of the permanent seminar as a moderator of this work session, which will not refer specifically to any election. Rather, we're going to be talking about the context of holding elections over the past year, which, as you all know, has been an odd way of handling things. It's very important to be able to acknowledge and understand what best practices have been established in organizing elections during pandemic. And so it's wonderful to have you moderating this special session. I would like to welcome all our dear friends, our specialists, our specialized analysts in elections, both here in Mexico and the rest of the world. And I'm sure that everybody is very interested in continuing to learn about the impact that the pandemic has had on elections globally. We have our dear friend, dear and old friend, old in the sense that we've known her for a long time, but she's very young in terms of her positioning, Rina Musali joining us, as well as Ricardo Becerra, who has been a longtime collaborator here with our organization. In addition to Trilce from the National Autonomous University of Mexico's Law School. I would like to make a few introductory remarks to tell you about why we're interested in this subject in this permanent seminar that we're organizing between our National Electoral Institute and the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We're accompanying each other in order to be able to create or provide a context of what's happening globally, how electoral systems are handling elections throughout the world, specifically within this context, because we also want to learn in terms of what we can do in our own elections in July of this year. And we are reflecting upon all of the different measures that can be taken in order to continue to hold our elections without any issues. The pandemic, elections and democracy have to be handled in different dimensions. The health dimension, for example, which sometimes requires that certain activities be carried out by the election organization authorities, as well as in terms of politicians involved in campaigns, because sometimes there are activities taking place that are absolutely contrary to what they should be doing as established by the health authorities, for example, to avoid large gatherings and so on. And then there's also the economic facet in terms of how we can handle elections, bearing in mind all of the inequalities we have, differences in economic levels, while at the same time protecting our democracy. On top of that, we know that democracy has been going through a stage of uncertainty. People don't trust it as much as in the past. And then because of all of the economic problems that have arisen because of the pandemic, people are even more discontent with what their situation is. And so the pandemic has affected many of our decisions. And we know that we have to handle things properly so as to avoid having a negative impact on our elections. We have to find a way as well to avoid exacerbation of the political problems that are taking place. We know that we have the case of Hungary, Turkey, Poland, of how sometimes power can go overboard in exercising its power and then take advantage of the pandemic to establish even greater controls. But we also have the issue of intolerance that sometimes raises its ugly head. And then we also have, finally, the social side of what's happening, which can also mean that the right to protest goes beyond what we can usually accept because it becomes so big, and that will sometimes require the need for use of force to control those types of expressions. And so that is why it's so important for us to continue to analyze the situation, because democracies run the risk of continuing to be in this very fragile state during the pandemic. And I would like to conclude my remarks by saying the biggest challenge we have before us in democratic societies, in contemporary democratic society, is that we have to make sure that our elections do not become another victim of the pandemic. So I'd like to thank once again the law school from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the organizers of this event at the National Electoral Institute. Thank you for organizing this event that I think will be extremely important to give us a better context of what's happening globally and help us with our own elections in July. Thank you very much for all of the panelists as well. Joseph, once again, thank you. Thank you, Lorenzo.
A continuación, y para ofrecer palabras a nombre de la Facultad de Derecho.
I would now like to hand the floor to the representative from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, from the law school. I'd like to hand the floor to Trilce Fabiola Ovilla Bueno. Thank you. At the National Autonomous University of Mexico, we're thrilled to be able to participate in seminars such as this one, which is the permanent seminar on elections and democracy worldwide, which has been organized by our law school and the National Electoral Institute. I am representing our university in terms of talking about how the pandemic has affected elections. We know that it's very important that we continue to make sure that our elections are handled lawfully. We have three very distinguished specialists joining us today: Rina Musali, Ricardo Becerra, and Joseph Thompson. And I'm sure that they will give us a very comprehensive view of how elections, electoral processes, and democratic life has been affected by COVID-19. And we also have to remember that it has affected the way in which we interact amongst ourselves. All of us, all of the stakeholders have changed the way in which we work. And we have changed the way in which we design our campaigns, how we provide information to voters, all of this to make sure that everybody has the necessary information in order to participate in elections. Elections have sometimes been viewed as an expression of different narratives, and those affect the results. But it's also important to know that voters are more critical and more analytical and much more digital, and therefore they're much more informed when talking about decisions that have to be reached, which is why we have to remember that COVID-19 came to add another level of complexity to what we were already facing globally. More than 60 countries had to change their electoral schedules, including Mexico, in which this had to be done because of COVID-19, which is why we want to acknowledge the work carried out by the INE, headed by Dr. Cordova. They've done a wonderful job to make sure that electoral processes are protected, while at the same time making sure that they safeguard our health. And now I'd like to hand the floor back to the experts, and I would just like to thank all of the participants in this event, as well as all of the organizers on the part of our law school, in addition to those of the INE. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ovilla. Now let's move on to the presentations to be made by our speakers today. Ms. Rina Musali will be analyzing the situation based on a study that she conducted of 30 elections that were held in 2018 and 2019, that is prior to this pandemic affecting us globally. And she'll also be telling us a little bit about the publication that was a result of her analysis of elections. She has an enormous number of ebooks that she's published. Amongst them is one that is entitled 100 Elections Globally. She has also written about AMLO and the world. AMLO is the current Mexican president. And so it's a pleasure to have her here with us. I'm not going to read her entire bio because I would just be taking up way too many minutes of her presentation, but I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be able to listen to her comments. And Ms. Musali, you have 30 minutes for your presentation. Rina, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Jose Thompson, for your introduction. I would also like to thank Dr. Cordova, the president of the council at the INE, for extending an invitation to participate at this permanent seminar organized by the INE and the law school at the UNAM, in addition to the authorities from Europe. I would also like to say hello to Ms. Ovilla, as well as Jose Thompson, who I have the privilege of having as the moderator at this event. During my presentation, I'd like to give you a global overview of what the elections looked like prior to the pandemic, and talk a little bit about how the results came in from the ballot boxes. And so I'll be using different systems, national and international systems, and I'll be referring to 10 modifiers of the status quo that showed that there was a global change taking place that led to the decline or the disenchantment or the crisis, if you want to call it, of liberal democracies. I would also like to tell you a little bit about what happened as of 2012. And if I have enough time, I'll also talk to you a little bit about the specific case of Mexico and the 2018 elections, when they had one of the biggest political changes they've ever had with the arrival of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which just goes to show you that no election can escape what is happening globally. And that is something that has also had an effect on all types of elections. I refer to the elections in 2012 because it has a lot to do with the international liberal order. In 2012, for example, Marine Le Pen became the third most widely voted person during the 2012 elections. Then the Five Star Movement in Italy wasn't able to set up a government, but it was the most voted government in 2010. In Greece, CDC won in 2014. In the UK, we have the Independence Party. The UK party, which is a populist party that was against Europe and that won a solid election in 2014. And then we also have the arrival of Trump in 2016, where Joe Biden has said over and over that Mr. Trump is a genius of illiberalism. And so this is just to show you what the situation was like previously. And there has been an authoritarian wave coming on to us over the years. In 2012, in international politics, it was a very unique year in the sense that of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, 4 of them held elections: Russia, France, the US, China. This country held its Communist Party Congress, and it also led to the election of Xi Jinping as their president. So in this panorama in which 4 of the most powerful countries in the world, the hegemonic countries, the one that control peace and security globally, might not happen once again until 2042 if things continue as they currently stand, because this is a situation that will not come up unless there are early elections, or if any governments fall, such as in the case of the UK, for example, or if the presidents aren't able to conclude their terms or the government terms change for one reason or another. But in general, I would say that this was an anomaly in international politics. And so it was interesting to say that so many countries were holding elections, and it was important to see how decision-making processes changed. There was a lot of uncertainty because a lot of presidents were kind of lame ducks, and the decision-making process globally was expectant to see what was going to happen. That was before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, we've seen a struggle between different powers as a result of what happened in the elections. There's a clash of open and closed voices, systems, anti-systems, nativists and protectionists, the struggle between the powers that focus on rationality versus others who have identity politics, fear-mongering, the truth or fake news. And there was also a clash between the elites and those who had been negatively affected, and they expressed themselves specifically in a country such as Mexico, where there was a clash between the points of view, political points of view, that led to a series of tension that led to problems during the elections. And all of this has to be seen in light of what was happening internationally, the changes and the mutations in governments that were also being affected because of the trends in international politics. The fourth industrial revolution, the migration problems that we were having, how ITC was changing us, all of these were shocks that also helped to define the electoral results and the collective and national decisions that were reached in elections, which is why we have to understand the connection between national and international when talking about votes. And this sometimes is something we lose sight of. Each country is different, but usually they have a series of very specific aspects, and they tend to not be affected by international affairs because it's a national event. That's what elections are. It's a moment in which the entire nation comes together, in which politics, economy, society, politics, culture all come together to lead to an individual decision that will have a collective impact. But the coming together, all of this also contributes to mutation of political processes. And so the vote, which shouldn't be viewed as an isolated event, rather something that is taking place within a series of connections in which there is a multilateral facet to everything that we sometimes do not notice, and we are nonetheless sometimes unable to remain totally separate from what is happening regionally and internationally. And elections also have implications in geopolitics, in global geopolitics. The continuity of global leaders has an impact on the distribution of global power and our ability to create partnerships and spheres of influence. Now, I'd like to share my screen with you to tell you a little bit about the 10 markers of the pre-pandemic status quo, which have affected the elections. Although you must remember that elections are always very national, but we also have to bear in mind these other additional factors. These are 10 modifiers of the international status quo that affect elections and that contribute to the decline of democracies and to an increase in nationalism. They are also 10 disruptors that affect society and affect this sense of going against the status quo, and they question whether liberalism is appropriate. Liberalism in the sense that borders are open, there's greater global trade, multiculturalism, and cooperation, multilateral cooperation. The governments that are more authoritarian and that sometimes pose a threat to democracies are also another point that are very important. There are certain countries, for example, that have been losing their ground in terms of their democracy, and they have become hybrid systems or completely autocratic systems. The first modifier I'm going to refer to, because this is the international environment that affects the entire election process. So this is the first modifier of the global status quo, which is automation or Industry 4.0. It's an important point to bring up because automation has led to unemployment, economic uncertainty. Our jobs are much more vulnerable and has led to social problems, which points to the importance of humans and how we can readily be replaced by smart machines, intelligent machines. And that's a very important point of the anti-system cry that has been heard throughout the world. And it has a lot to do with the fact that people are against automation. There's a direct relationship between automation and elections, according to Benedict Frey from Oxford, who has stated that 10% of automation or robotization in Michigan has led to Republicans winning the elections, and because what was happening.
Perdón. Perfecto, sigo adelante. Una menor exposición a la automatización. Sigo adelante. Bueno. Sí, quería comentar también
Yes.
que una menor
I also wanted to say that lower exposure to automation in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin would have also caused Hillary Clinton to win the Electoral College. So there is a clash between automation and robotization with, as a result of political effects in electoral scenarios where nationalist parties benefit. Now, there is a group of authors that stated, as it cries from the Sussex University and Italians, Maximo Anelli and Piero Stani also said, technology produces more employment or job displacement compared to trade. In the case of Mexico, who voted for López Obrador, three major sectors, that of retail, trade, and agricultural activities, for example, which are prone to automation, which means that nationalist parties appeal to this social base with a promise of rejuvenating industries and restoring employment lost. Now, another international shock that we cannot overlook is the 2008 global financial crisis, which is associated with the exhaustion of the neoliberal economic model that produced losses for working and middle classes, and a financial class that has an epicenter in advanced economies, but that is developing a new economic cycle in Europe, which opened the last decade with economic slowdown, unemployment, more public debt, fiscal discipline, and austerity plans, which anticipates the fall down of governments with punishment vote against traditional political parties. There are studies that reveal that after a crisis like this, like the one in 2008, votes would be headed in the direction of these political parties. That is, extreme right-wing parties grew by 30% in terms of voters as a result of this clash of forces. This is stated by the Institute of Research of Munich University. The consequences of the financial crisis are not only visible in Europe. We also saw that during the Arab Spring with a famine, shortage of foods and unemployment, which led to social unrest and protests that sought to overthrow power. In the case of Mexico also, for example, López Obrador and other populist leaders used the sequels and the uncertainty of the 2008 financial crisis to empower their anti-elite and ultranational discourse. Mexico experienced losses as a result of a shock in the US because they are our main commercial partner. AMLO developed a narrative as a social leader with these sequels and this uncertainty, linking this to the neoliberal movement exhaustion. Another modifier of the status quo is the anti-globalization creed or discourse. In other words, populists who have also had a political career with an anti-global discourse have found a political profit among the losers of globalization, an asymmetric and uneven and unfair globalization that has fueled the anti-system anger against political parties that are traditional. Daniel Simback has said that social inequality is breaking the political contract of democratic representation. Donald Trump and López Obrador give a political and representative voice to anger and to the losers of globalization. Trump looks at globalization as a transfer of income and employment products from the West to the East, which also explains the new kind of Cold War we're living with China. So they capitalize all this internal resentment, which has to do with an international force. So this is also important to understand. As a matter of fact, Brexit itself can also be interpreted as an anti-globalization movement with the message that globalization can be reversed. And then we have the advent of populism in Europe. Since 2011 in Syria with the war, millions of families had to be displaced from their places of origin and had to migrate to other continents and countries, which has fueled sentiment against open borders and against the liberal political creed or discourse. All this was backed by a series of anti-system parties to stop the Muslim Europe. So what we have is that this European narrative for the European narrative of Europe for Europeans, Italy for Italians, but this is also based on the Syrian problem. In Latin America, what we share with Syria is the financial crisis of 2008, which favors the change of a system. While Syrians fight against the Assad dynasty that has been in power since the 1970s, in Mexico, people fight against the mafia in power. We share the me anti-elite sentiment and this almighty message of changing the system. Also, the Arab Spring was preceded by electoral frauds in Yemen, Algeria, on several occasions. In Egypt, they questioned the elections in 2005 won by Mubarak. And while this happened, also at the same time, López Obrador took over under the claim of an electoral fraud in 2006, which was preceded by the fall down of the electoral system in 2008. So it's important to understand what's happening and how all of this is interrelated. Let me now continue with the nationalist and identity structure, because all these working classes that lost to globalization also lost status and a sense of belonging, which is attractive because that's a nationalist sentiment. Fukuyama says that the identity politics is shaping electoral preferences. In Europe, there is an effort to reaffirm the white and non-Muslim identity. The same happens with the Anglo-Saxon right by Trump. In Mexico, Morena is a political party, a superstructure that seeks to protect those affected by the system and give them voice after many years of exclusion. Now, let's go to Brexit. Brexit is an outcry to control their trade borders and their economy, but that goes beyond borders. They seek to close borders to migration, and they are seeking to deinstitutionalize supranationality in Europe. Brexit also seeks to stop the loss of identity of the country as a result of migrant quotas. And this is interesting because the anti-globalizing periphery in Britain, and the oxide belt in the US, which are the losers to globalization, it has been shown that several of their locations have been the regions with the deepest penetration of imports from China, which means that the international factor is also embedded there when it comes to voting. In the case of Trump, they blew out the coexistence of the US with the world with a plot to destroy state institutions. We saw that on January 6th. And Trump gave a voice to an angry sector of society, angry at the sequels of the financial crisis of 2008 and robotization and industrialization and globalization that benefits the East more than the West, and a commercial deficit or a trade deficit that reflects the anger of the working class. It's his arrival also shows that that the white class, Anglo-Saxon class in the US is not happy with this demographic tsunami. Now, before I wrap up in my last minutes, I want to talk about a multilateralist siege, because there is an equivalent in the global notion in the sense that there is a rejection of institutions globally. And there we have, for example, that we have leaderships that always seek to divide or polarize. They're making trouble all the time. For example, Trump's initial budget cut down international cooperation and their commitment towards democracy. So we have a deconstruction of the international establishment. Not only deconstructing the national establishment in each country if you have populist leaders, you also have forces that seek to deconstruct the international establishment. And finally, we have the so-called fake news. which are democratizing communication with robotics. I mean, we have a fourth industrial revolution launched based on AI, the intensive use of the internet, big data, and robotization, and all these changes the patterns of how we communicate and manage information. And this new way to manage information has a direct impact on elections and democracy. So we are seeing a democratization of communication because information is decentralized, and we have a multiplication of message senders. Communication is not well organized, and now it's a lot easier to amplify and empower or boost messages, including all this deal about fake news. The MIT has said that fake news in Twitter have moved farther, deeper, and faster than the truth. So the current communication model is disruptive, and it is not limited to Mexico or the US or a country in Europe or Asia or Africa. It is part of international trends, and it is key for the arrival of populist leaders. And we also have the anti-system sentiment in Latin America, which is permeated by the drop in income for individuals as a result of fall in international prices of oil and commodities. Another modifier of the status quo in Latin America is the religious factor and the weight of evangelical vote. And finally, we also have the issue of corruption. That is what is disrupting the electoral scene in Latin America is the issue of corruption, which is choking democracy and fueling the popularity of strong men. And I think I have only a few minutes left. Yes, I have very little time left. But I would like to say that when AMLO or López Obrador took over, there were 27 populist leaders in the world. In his first election in 2016, there were 16 populist leaders. That is when he ran for office for the first time. That was back in 2016, excuse me. In 2016, 23, and in 2018, 27. And we have seen ever since then also the addition of others like Nayib Bukele, Salvador, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Zelensky in Ukraine, Boris Johnson with elections in the UK in 2019, Narendra Modi in India, Bujari in Nigeria. And we had elections to the European Parliament, Belarus in 2020, and all the electoral cycle also that we will have in 2021. So in this pre-pandemic world, we were able to feel the power of this collective rage and anti-system sentiment that was born out of domestic issues, but affected by these 10 modifiers of a status quo globally that helped engender this anger against the elites, an outcry for deconstruction. So thanks a lot, and well, I'll be paying attention to your comments and opinions. Thanks a lot, Rina Musali. An interesting scenario. That's what you just shared with us. An interesting scenario of the world prior to the arrival of the new coronavirus, which ended up disrupting normality, which reminds us that the problems of democracy and the emergence of populist movements was brewing already before the arrival of this new situation that has definitely exacerbated some of these factors. And if you have any doubts, think about this. Instead of becoming a more global, despite having been affected by the global pandemic, we have become more nationalist. And if you doubt it, look at what has happened in the last few days. this conflict between the EU and Great Britain over the number of vaccines that have to be distributed to the countries in the EU. You must have heard about these allegations in the sense that some developed countries are offering to pay more for vaccines compared to underdeveloped countries, which would lead to an imbalance in the distribution of vaccines. And well, what Rina just mentioned is interesting. We need to think about all these changes. We're seeing changes globally faster than people can absorb. We're talking about an economy that is globalized with more intensity each time, but that leaves some sectors aside. And these sectors start to develop anti-globalization and anti-system sentiments and seek more populist movements with a crisis of political parties in general. So Rina just shared an interesting analysis of how technological, financial factors and the emergence of this combination between nationalism and religious sentiments or conservative sentiments has led major countries to appoint or to vote for populist leaders, which has an impact on international matters, which is not limited to Donald Trump. Rina just mentioned that when López Obrador won elections, by that time there were 27 populist leaders worldwide. So that's a good perspective, especially in the case of Latin America, which in 2019 had a really intense year when it comes to protests and disenchantment with some bouts of violence. And also the inability of some states to react to these resentment. They had to rethink their strategies. In what Rina just shared, you get the impression that there is this nostalgic feeling about the past, a desire to deconstruct the present and go back to the past, going back to the concept of sovereignty and isolate ourselves, like that was possible or viable in the world we live in. But as this singer Sabina says, there is no worse nostalgic sentiment that longing for what never happened. And nevertheless, this moves people. What we saw so evidently in the Brexit, because they wanted to pull out of the European Pact to make Great Britain great again, or Trump's slogan, which says, let's make America great again. In that regard, I believe that that was very interesting. Thank you for your thoughts, Rina. They are interesting, and it helps us understand that what we're living now is not only new, but it adds to a series of national and international and regional factors and processes that were already making a democracy struggle, and were leading some people to seek not so democratic and not so pro-system solutions like they did in the past. Next, we have a presentation by Dr. Ricardo Becerra, who is the president of the Institute of Studies for Democratic Transition. He was also a high-level officer of the Federal Electoral Institute at the time. At the time, it was the National Electoral Institute in Mexico, and he's the author of several books and other publications. Actually, he received the National Journalism Award and the Ondas Award in Spain for the series of articles Mexico and its story of democracy. So to bring us back to the present, moving away from that vision of recent past, he will talk about the present situation and how we are experiencing the combination of these factors plus the presence of the pandemic. So I give you the floor, Ricardo. Go ahead, please.
Tu micrófono está apagado, Ricardo.
Your mic is off, Ricardo.
Debo agradecer.
First of all, I want to thank each and all of you, including the organizers, for the invitation for me to participate, for us to participate in this session. And I say us because I'm also talking about Reina. Thanks to the Venice Council, thanks to the Law School of the National University, and of course, thanks to the National Electoral Institute. It's a real challenge to speak about my topic after Reina, because we have a very complex world, especially that prior to the pandemic, she set the bar really high. I'll try to be concise because I don't typically identify these major trends. What I typically do is figure out how different countries, especially democratic countries, are dealing with the worst and the main problem of mankind in this century at least, except for the Second World War. Can we just show the presentation? This was prepared by Professor Monica Rebolleda and me. What we are to explore here, Jose, Trilce, Fernando, and Ogesto, is a perspective compared the old way. I mean, we resorted to documents available. And I'm talking about literature because there has been a lot of literature and news about the management of the pandemic in the different countries of the world. And based on this comparison and an effort to find similarities between nations, especially democratic nations, we have come up with the following results. The next one, please. The fight of the pandemic in a democratic context and with a comparison. That is the focus of this presentation.
¿Qué es más precisamente el diagnóstico que vamos a presentar?
What do we mean by this assessment? Well, this is an assessment to identify the possibilities and the capabilities of democracy to deal with a universal problem, a pandemic. It is an update as of January 27 on a major part of the world. Dr. Rebolleda's research is broader, but for the sake of time, we chose only a group of countries. We have a proposed framework for the analysis of meta event because we need a framework to establish this comparison between different nations, like between South Korea and Colombia. We also aim at identifying lessons for democratic government, and also this assessment is not conclusive. It is an open tasking process. If I had had an opportunity to present this topic last month, I would have chosen different countries and different moments and different public policy guidelines. But I mean, the movement is so much, and the conflicts are so constant, and the outcome of the pandemic is so changing that what was good in November is now really bad. This is the framework we'll try to share briefly. Well, What about governing the pandemic? As this English wise man Skidelsky just said, for the first time in the history of mankind, we are facing a common problem like it was a mathematical problem. There is no country in the world that has not aimed at flattening the curve, which is now a very common phrase that everybody has heard in the last few months. Well, that's the effort, and that has shaped the problem or modeled the problem to attempt to predict the damage, which is unavoidable prior to the pandemic, so that this impact is as smooth as possible over time, and so the health system can cope with it. This is the basis for the comparison, because this is the main idea in the minds of all governments in the world, including authoritarian governments. By definition, under a pandemic, you work with a high level of uncertainty. You have a new agent, and therefore we have a new disease. It has an unprecedented character because human beings had never faced this evil, and we didn't know, and we still ignore many of its main characteristics and several of its forms of spread. And that's why governments have been making decisions with limited and insufficient information, trying to identify patterns as they go, and with assumptions of what is probable or possible. This is what this slide says. Let's feel pity for governments, because there is a high level of uncertainty when it comes to what's happening at present. What can we do during this dark moment of uncertainty as countries, as democracies, as political regimes, if there is not a vaccine to immunize humans, and if there is no available treatment or a cure? There are three major public policy lines of action that exist today. The first policy is that of lockdown and social distancing, which is the first and maybe the toughest of all the policy conditions. And then we have the hospital reconversion policy, and until recently, recently, we discovered in May the universal and compulsory or mandatory use of face masks. Now, a scientific progress will lead to other comparison processes that will be interesting. The arrival of treatments to prevent the seriousness of the disease, and of course, immunization through the use of vaccines. In these five areas is where the state's capacity to deal with the pandemic is at stake. Now, the great question in this period from the standpoint of political science and economic science is, what is the capacity of governments to impose quarantines on their population, to embark on major hospital reconversion processes during the pandemic, and also to persuade their populations for the universal use of face masks, to have a widespread, efficient treatment, and deploy a major vaccination strategy, which is just beginning. So these five areas or things are the basis for the comparison. In all of them, however, information and communication are an essential or crucial component. At the end of the day, the assessment of government actions and the actions of democracies will depend on these five conditions. But it is one thing to be in an authoritarian country, and something very different is to live in a democratic context. In a democratic context, the difficulties are quite larger when it comes to govern or control the pandemic. No democratic government has been able to get rid of this need to manage the pandemic. And it's just that the democratic context establishes a game that has a punishment for governments that fail to do what they need to do. This has been a main trend when it comes to managing the pandemic worldwide. We see presidents delegating responsibility to governments, governors who do not want to deal with the pandemic, the difficulty in coordination between different levels of government, etc. That's what we have seen, which is one of the factors that explains many of the failures, especially when it comes to reopening economies worldwide.
When we talk about a free press that is interested in making the information readily available, particularly the negative information that the government has to respond to. And in democracies, we also have to remember that governments and their spokespersons have to persuade the population of certain behaviors. They have to compel, communicate, and inspire confidence so as to be able to achieve certain social attitudes and mobilizations that are highly desired. And this is a key point of the pandemic, to be able to communicate properly and provide information. In a nutshell, in a democracy, governing the pandemic implies that you have to work in an environment of uncertainty and to be clear enough to be able to learn as you go about this previously unknown agent, as to how you have to handle it, protect yourself, make sure that you communicate properly and persuade people of the desired behaviors. And that is something that also requires a free press that is very much aware of what's happening. And for this seminar, we also have to remember that there is a global context of surveillance and follow-up. For example, Japan currently does not accept flights coming in from Mexico because they believe that Mexico has not controlled the pandemic. There are other European countries that have also forbidden the entry of travelers from the UK, for example, for the same reason, and because of the new strain of the virus that has come about in the UK. And so globally, we are being watched in terms of how, globally, that is, we are being watched as to how we are handling the pandemic, because it affects their own security and safety and health, in addition to what organizations such as the World Health Organization and the UN itself does. Something I would like to highlight, because how democracies handle the pandemic have led to a certain type of tension, actual tension that has led to uprisings, even the fall of governments throughout these past few months, because many of the measures required by the pandemic, those 5 measures, they require restrictions to be established, or the suppression of, what's more, some basic rights. For example, a lockdown, which does not allow people to move around freely. It does not allow them to gather in meetings. That's another suppression of the freedom to gather. There's also the involvement of the government in your own privacy in order to determine whether somebody is ill, and the right to attend school and work has also been affected. And there's another very important point I'd like to bring up, in the sense that it has posed a challenge because many times electoral processes have had to be postponed. How have democracies dealt with all of these challenges? Well, that's what underlies my entire presentation. This discussion arose in May in 2020 originally. just as the epidemic was
La tasa de mortalidad
affecting us.
países
And here I'm referring to May the 1st. The mortality rate in autocracies was one of 73 deaths per million in autocracies. But in democracies, that number was 657 per million. That number seemed to point to the fact that democracies were ill-prepared to be able to face a terrible public health issue, as was the case with the pandemic. We believe that the COVID measures would clash so clearly with rights that democracies had in place for so many years that it would be extremely difficult to make sure that people would comply with certain measures, because it would also be economically very expensive. This is something we already saw in May, and it was mentioned by Adam Przeworski in the quote that you see at the bottom of the screen. And it seemed that democracies were going to be unable to face this pandemic on May the 1st. Moving on to a comparative analysis. This is what the world looked like a few days ago, with the US having the highest numbers. They had more than 100 million confirmed cases globally and more than 2 million deaths globally. Now let's take a look at each one of the countries and how each one of the countries, because this is a selection that I made for this seminar, in which I'll be telling you a little bit about how each country managed it and the specific guidelines that they set up. Germany did a wonderful job. It increased the number of available beds. It tripled the number in less than a month and a half. It also provided the first rapid test with a very sound clinical and scientific system. It was able to conduct a large number of tests, and it had a significant team of trackers, the biggest one in the entire world, and they worked in a very disciplined manner. But in September or October, perhaps they grew too confident, they relaxed certain measures, and there was a lack of coordination within the German government, has led to their currently being in a position in which the pandemic has exploded and which had previously been able to avoid. And all of this is putting the hospital capacity of the country at risk, even for such an important country as Germany. Then we have Brazil, which has an example of one of the worst ways to handle the pandemic. And here I would just mention something that is totally anti-democratic. For several months, Brazil was not providing information to its population regarding how COVID was progressing in the country. It simply closed down its website, and it simply ceased to provide any information to the public as well as to the press, because they believed that there had been a lot of misinformation that had led to a lot of controversy, issues with the press. And this is an example of how this pandemic in this country, which calls itself democratic, was able to suspend critical conversations. Another point I would bring up is that the Brazilian Congress realized that they had to establish an economic policy in order to be able to ensure that people could stay at home, and provided a basic income for a few months so Brazilians could have the possibility of staying home. The next example is that of Canada. Canada is an example of good management. They had the advantage of having epidemic or pandemic experience in 2013, I believe, with MERS, and they were able to comply with very strict measures. But because of a lack of social discipline, they find themselves in a worse situation than they were during the first wave. Once again, there was excess confidence, too much confidence on their part, and the lack of planning, which led to an uptick in the pandemic numbers in Canada. Fortunately for Canadians, they have a very broad and diverse vaccine plan. I think it's one of the best globally. They have 2.3 times more vaccines than they require for their entire population. Then we have China. China isn't here because it's a democracy, rather because of the contrary, and because it was also the source of the pandemic. China is a gigantic country that is enormous. It always undertakes mass measures that sometimes might seem exaggerated. And I'll give you a few examples. China was the first country which took a census. They gave tests they tested all the population of Wuhan. 14 million inhabitants in Wuhan were tested in less than 2 weeks. And it also did a serious lockdown, a very strict lockdown. And it seemed then that China, which would be a country that we could perhaps copy in terms of the measures, but the cost in terms of democratic rights that nation had to pay was extremely high, because they had to censor the press, and they required that people stay at home during the curfew, for example, and that had a significant impact on the democracy. Then we have another example from South America, Colombia, which is very different from what happened in Brazil. I think that they did a lot of good things, such as properly communicating what was happening with the pandemic, but as is the case in other Latin American countries, because of economic conditions, was unable to continue with the suspension of economic activities. And when they reopened their doors and when they weakened their social distancing measures, especially during December, they find themselves currently in a very dire situation right now. South Korea, look at the number of deaths. 1,378 deaths. In South Korea, throughout the entire pandemic, in more than 11 months, they have had as many deaths as we have had here in Mexico City in a single day. And the success has been the success lies in the test that they carried out. Nobody ever discussed it. It was clear to them that they would have to test the entire population to see who had the bug and how to properly isolate them. This led to the success of South Korea, in addition to the fact that they had good economic policies in place and that they were able to have good health personnel in place. They had to make some changes because in September, October, they allowed mass gatherings, and that's what led to some super spreader events. And in any case, I would say that they have conducted, or they have tested more inhabitants than any other country in the world. The next example is from Spain. They did a poor job. Perhaps Spain's problem is that they took the right measures, but too late. This explains the enormous difficulties that Spain has had in going back to normal. Although once they started to do things properly, they did things such as mass testing and so on. And now it seems 78% of the population has been tested at some point, and they were able to avoid this endemic. That is to say, to avoid seasonal flu with COVID-19. The US is another example of how terribly we can face the disease, with 417,000 plus deaths up until just a few days ago. And it's an example of what not to do. And One of the things I would highlight is the fact that in 2017 and in 2018, they dismantled the Global Center for Epidemic Management. That health agency for biological defense was closed. Its main scientists were removed from their positions, but they were the ones who were basically able to contain Ebola back in 2002. So the first measures taken by President Trump were not accompanied by the best scientists that they had. And that's why they had such poor results. But the Biden plan seems to be pointing in the opposite direction. They want to have the biggest experiment in vaccination that has ever taken place, in which they want to vaccinate 1 million people per day up until April. That is how big the change and the challenge that the U.S. is facing is. Asking for the next one, but I don't know if it's stuck. Okay. India. India was a country which was handling things well. It worked in a very scientific manner. It was the first country that developed technology to have low-cost testing available to them. And they continue to have a low lethality rate, perhaps because there's a lack of information, but because there is a lack of information and because there are issues between provincial governments and the central government has led to the failure of the program and has led to an increase in the number of deaths and the need to increase the number of lockdowns in that country. So as you can see, it's always a combination of factors. This is a case of Israel, which is interesting because it made a significant change in the way it was initially handling the disease. Although you can see up on the screen that they've had 4,000 plus deaths and have been highly criticized because they had poorly managed most of the cases and deaths. And the hospital care, it seems that the system didn't collapse, and obviously things went poorly during the initial months of the pandemic, but then they made corrections, and by July, they had already realized that there was a true possibility of obtaining vaccines, and it was the first country to negotiate large shipments of the vaccine to be able to quickly vaccinate its population, which is why we believe that they have an extraordinary strategy in place that is correcting the curve in Israel. The next phase, the vaccination phase, is something that they have been handling in a surprisingly good manner, rather. They had managed to already vaccinate more 50% of the population, which is approximately 4.4 million people. Next is Japan. Japan has an acceptable record, although there is a lot of criticism within the country itself, but it seems that Japan, because it's so socially disciplined, it's very accustomed to different types of disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, nuclear crises. They're very disciplined, and they always comply with all of the requests made by the authorities. And they also have another type of culture and different types of habits that led it to be totally different in the way it reacted. They use face masks on a daily basis, almost for anything, to go out on the streets, to protect themselves against pollen and pollution. It's the country that uses the most number of face masks, and that has been the case for decades. In the West, it wasn't until May when we realized that face masks were going to be more important than anything. But that together with their discipline explains the low number of deaths and their ability to control the pandemic. And I don't know why Japan hasn't really focused on the use of testing in order to continue to control the pandemic, but that's the way they're handling. Then we have New Zealand, which has got the highest ratings in many studies, including our own. Look at the numbers of deaths, 25. 25 people have died throughout a year in New Zealand due to COVID. There are a lot of things that can be said about New Zealand, but I think what I would highlight is that it has had the most compelling information and communication, and that has had the highest sense of empathy, which distinguishes it from other countries. Prime Minister Ait, as well as all of the spokespersons that they have in New Zealand, have managed to help that population understand the proper measures that they have to follow and the need to collaborate so that they can socially control the virus. New Zealand's case is particularly important because it's an example of social discipline that was acquired during the crisis, not previously as was the case of Japan, rather something that they were able to acquire during the crisis. And it's possible and it can be done in a democracy. I'm almost finished. Then we have the UK, which is the oldest democracy. It's a benchmark for many of our freedoms, and they did a terrible job. Once again, I don't know if it was because of negligence, and they even had to apologize. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, had to apologize for how he handled it. He did everything very late. And the tests, as well as the hospital beds, were something that they started to carry out very late into the pandemic. And it took them weeks. They postponed everything for weeks, which was very much a point of concern for most of the population. And the lack of information and communication led to the fact that a lot of other voices, not necessarily scientific voices, to be more important when communicating what was happening with the pandemic. And getting rid of all of those fake news sources and getting rid of all of that misinformation was one of the biggest problems that the UK has had to face, because it was unable to properly lead communication from the beginning. Next. Vietnam. This is a democracy that has its issues, but if you had to be inspired, I mean, if as a Mexican, you had to be inspired by any country that is similar to us in terms of the population and the type of economy, we should look at what's happening in Vietnam. They have had 35 deaths throughout the entire pandemic. Vietnam's case is something that can be readily studied. They're a source of inspiration for many countries. It's their prime minister has had one of the best scientific management of the situation. Since February, he's been holding meetings on a weekly basis with the main global epidemic centers. So Vietnam and the measures that Vietnam takes are the latest, are the most appropriate, are the cutting line measures based on scientific experience. And they were also the first ones to close their border with China, which was economically very expensive and very difficult. But thanks to those two measures, the fact that they quickly closed their borders, Vietnam has this very low number of deaths, with just 35, and it's seen no drop in its GDP. On the contrary, in spite of the pandemic, Vietnam is growing.
Consideraciones finales. Esto es nuestra
Final comments.
doctora.
These are the conclusions that Dr. Rebolledo and myself have reached.
Así ha gestionado el mundo su pandemia.
This is the way the world has managed the pandemic. Our study includes other countries as well, but we didn't have enough time to refer to all of them on this occasion. But as you've seen, the pandemic is requiring us to limit our democratic rights and freedoms. This study shows that 75 countries were in conditions to postpone their elections, not canceled, simply postpone their elections during the pandemic times.
Por contra, 101 países en este rally democrático y electoral que tuvimos en el
I would also add that during 2020, 101 countries nonetheless decided to not postpone or cancel anything and simply move ahead with their originally scheduled elections. This is something that is important for us to mention because what we have is, I believe, an understanding and a will on the part of and the will on the part of our societies that in spite of everything that is happening, understanding that our democracies are very important for our government as well as our societies, which is why we can reach the following conclusions. And with this, I would conclude my comments. As you've seen, political leadership and management has become the most important factor, much more so than the political system. That is to say, our ability to control this enormous and terrible problem does not lie on whether you're an autocracy, a tyrant, a democracy, or a populist, although obviously they do have some bearing. But the leadership and the way in which you prepare to face the pandemic and the types of decisions you reached are more important than whether you are a parliamentary system, presidential system, autocracy, or democracy. That's something that is affecting the entire world. As you saw initially, even Adam Przeworski was very pessimistic as to how the whole situation would be handled in democracies. But in January 21, we've seen that democracies have been able to come out of this well, such as in the case of New Zealand and South Korea. The second conclusion would be that pre-existing structural conditions, that is to say, a sound health system, extensive scientific research, financial resources, extensive financial resources, economic possibilities, and so on, have not been the decisive factors. For example, we have the U.S. The U.S. has the biggest health system in the entire world, and yet it has an incredibly high death rate and mortality rate. And the same could be said of the UK. And we could also say the opposite of Vietnam, which is a country that has a weak system, health system, a third world country system, poorly equipped, with experience for sure in handling of other types of epidemics and disasters, but it has shown that it has been able to properly handle the pandemic. So then prior structural conditions are not the main point either. The third conclusion is that so far democracies have been willing to sacrifice the rights and freedoms of their people for the sake of health. But this is something that has been reaching a maximum because people are tired of being locked up and because of all of the disciplinary measures, which is why there is greater tension between the sacrifice of having to let go of their rights on behalf of their health. And yet, in spite of this very tense scenario that, as we've seen, has led to crises in countries such as Holland, Germany, Italy, in addition to Spain and other countries. And in spite of all of this, no democracy worldwide has decided to cancel its elections in a definitive manner. As Dr. Cordova said, it would seem that democracies, or rather democratic elections, are not going to be, or so far at least have not become, another victim of the pandemic. And I think that that is good news that we should highlight at this point in time. And lastly, this is something I didn't have enough time to talk about, but I think it's important that we talk about something, if only briefly, in the seminar. The way in which the democracies have been acting have been very important in how they handle the elections in this context. And I'm glad, because if for no other reason, democracies are good for avoiding poor governments and establishing more efficient governments. And so the way in which this problem is being faced will determine the consciousness and will have an effect on how we view our elections in each one of our countries. For the US is a good example. The pandemic not only affected Trump's popularity, not only did it put a stop to the economic growth that the US economy had up until 2019, but the pandemic also changed the way in which campaigns were handled, and it led to the possibility of virtual voting or mail-in voting, and it let President Biden find a way to criticize this method that had been determined by the US government up until then in dealing with the pandemic. But that is something that has happened in other parts of the world. In Israel, for example, the popularity of Prime Minister Netanyahu has risen drastically since the vaccine stage has begun, because they've done a very good job of it. And so, as we say, it's an ongoing situation, but we have to permanently analyze what's happening and stay abreast of what is happening, because of all of the lessons that we've learned throughout the world. All of these decisions that have happened throughout the world will affect each one of our countries when we hold our elections over the next few months, which will still be very difficult for the very near future. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo, por esta presentación.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this comparison presentation, which is fascinating, because he gave us an overview of how we reacted to the pandemic, because not everybody reacted in the same way. And we didn't follow the right direction in all cases. That was particularly true in the initial stages, because we had this lack of coordination between international organizations, which should have suggested measures more clearly. And especially the problem with the coronavirus is that it was detected in a late stage of its development. I mean, by protocol, you know that international organizations and countries must analyze water samples periodically. And we learned that the virus was already there in China since the year before the last. And in Brazil, it was traced back to November 2019. So that neglect allowed the coronavirus to evolve because it had not been identified. And therefore, this is pointing to one of the lessons we should take globally. We should keep a close eye on this scientific surveillance, as well as the capacity to react to these pandemics, because this is not the first pandemic in history, and it won't be the last for sure. It won't be the last we will have to deal with. I liked pretty much the idea of how this disease was approached or has been approached as a mathematical model, and these efforts to flatten the curve. Like in my country, in Costa Rica, at 1 p.m. every single day, the government organized a press conference, even with the presence of the president sometimes, but typically you would have a health minister and the president of the social security system in Costa Rica, because they are in charge of the hospital system. I mean, initially they had the highest ratings because everybody would turn on their TV to hear the latest news and receive information. What happened? Over time, as opposed to being a good information mechanism, this evolved into an arithmetic exercise. Today we have 280 new infections and this number of casualties, and we have this number of beds left in ICUs. So it went from a success rating event to a complete ratings failure, because after a few months of listening to this information that didn't say much, people preferred to look elsewhere because they didn't focus on measures and suggestions. On the other hand, they imposed a lockdown when they shouldn't have done it, because at the time when they imposed the lockdown, the cases were few, and now that we have a lot more, it's difficult for them to impose lockdowns. And something else Ricardo says or pointed to was the different capacities of governments or states to deal with the pandemic. In Latin America, the economies of many countries have not been able to cope with the pandemic, and that has led to political and economic decisions to reopen economies, at least partially, in different sectors as a result of pressure exerted by society. I won't dwell on the comparison of management of cases, the national number of cases, which Ricardo did brilliantly. But let me just touch upon one success story, which is the story of Taiwan. But surprisingly, islands would seem to fare better compared to continental territories. There you have Iceland, New Zealand, Taiwan. They are among the most successful countries in this matter. Of course, isolating is easier by definition for an island. And in that regard, I would like to go back to what Ricardo said at the end. I mean, because he talked about democracy as a potential victim of the pandemic. It has proven resilient, and it has recovered even though the system was highly questioned. Democracy has also become a factor or an element of decision for voters, which is fascinating, especially if you compare the position of Trump in opinion polls in March 2020 compared to the latest electoral results. There you will see a substantial change worth at least 20 percentage points. And I believe that the change was falling short because his administration was completely erratic. And obviously, we also underestimated the economic cost of the pandemic and therefore its effect on the economies of the families in the U.S. Of course, that has also become a factor in our country. But the most important element is what Ricardo just said. Democracies continued to hold elections. They delayed them as much as possible, but they continued to hold elections. And one piece of information that I would dare to highlight based on our online or in-person observations of elections in Latin America is that there is no evidence that elections have led to increased infections, which is important because that clearly shows that we can reconcile health care with the holding of elections. And as I mentioned earlier, in the case of Latin America, we have an additional problem when it comes to suspending them. What happens is that election dates are constitutional mandates. So you get to a point where you cannot delay them anymore. And there is a big difference compared to a parliamentarian countries which can hold elections whenever they are called, which can be within 3 months or within 3 years. The truth is that this gives them a level of flexibility that our countries do not necessarily have. But I don't want to monopolize the use of the microphone. There is a number of comments. I will ask Rina and Ricardo to take a look at the chat box because we already have a significant number of thoughts, comments, and questions. For example, to what extent influencers have been stealing popularity away from politicians, and what can this mean? And the question for Rina in particular, what do you think about the end of the term of Angela Merkel's administration in Germany? And to what extent can this have an impact on Europe, which is already having a series of internal communications problems in the bloc? And there's another comment on the strategy in Vietnam, which has already been addressed by Ricardo in his presentation. And there is a reference to science, and also somebody here speaks about the lack of social solidarity. I mean, I don't know to what extent that the pandemic has exposed the lack of social solidarity and how it has exacerbated solidarity. I read a fascinating study about Spain that said that even in quote unquote impoverished countries, if you will find that comparisons are better between cities as opposed to comparisons between countries. There are cities in Peru or in Mexico or Costa Rica whose inhabitants have a life expectancy that is comparable with developed countries with the best health systems in the world, which is fascinating because that clearly shows the different gradients in our countries depending on where you live. And at the same time, we have cities in El Salvador or Honduras where life expectancy is worse than that in Iraq. So this is all very interesting seen from this perspective. So I don't know if you can help me by reading the questions. You can answer and make some comments. We have a little time left to address these and any other questions that you may have heard. There is a difficult question for Rina. What is the post-pandemic scenario we could have? So we'll follow the same order. First, we'll have Rina Musali so she can refer to these different comments or questions. Thanks, Jose. Yes, I had an opportunity to look at some of the questions in the chat. When it comes to influencers, this is closely related to the way communication is managed in the 21st century, which is not limited to a given country. This is an international disruptor that somehow leads to a ripple effect in other countries. So communication is being decentralized. We have a disorganized system of communication. There are several communication channels, even alternatively. This has had an impact on the way communication takes place. We're witnessing a new relationship between the state and journalism, for example. we see the state and on one hand, and then the media in general. And of course, as the comment says, we have a series of influencers that could have more likes than a prime minister or a president or a head of a state. So communication is a lot more direct, more instant between audiences and leaders mainly. So this is something that we have to see as a mechanism or a system that has a ripple effect worldwide. This has an impact on the way information is consumed and used, and its impact on democracies. As to the question on Germany and Angela Merkel, she has been in power for 16 years. She will literally leave a void, an important void, not only in Germany, but also in the EU. Because what we are seeing is that the EU, it depends on this duopoly. I mean, in this dual support between France and Germany. On one hand, we have elections to be held in France in 2022 on one hand, and elections in Germany will take place in 2021 with the exit of Merkel. So far, what we can see is a lot of support for Christian Democratic Union Party, which is the party of Angela Merkel. They are ahead on the polls. We have Emil Lucier, who is an important leader. He is standing out right now as a leader of the Angela Merkel party. He's a moderate pro-European, of course, candidate. He's a pro-migrant, but a conservative at the same time. So what does it mean to see this arrival of the new leadership for the world and Europe? At the moment, where the transatlantic union or partnership with the US is or has been damaged because of the support from Trump to the NATO and a series of attacks on international politics. We'll have to keep an eye on what happens with Germany. I believe that this is a really important election. We have others like Italia, where Giuseppe Conte just quit. They haven't announced upcoming elections, but they're a G7 country. On the other hand, I believe that the elections were held early this year in Liechtenstein. In Bulgaria, we'll have elections, so we have to keep an eye on Europe. We also have elections in the Netherlands amid the exit of Max Rutte as a result of a discrimination scandal, but his political party is ahead on the polls. And they may again, he may again get for the consecutive mandate, which would be the oldest or the longest in a position after Angela Merkel. So we'll have to keep an eye on Europe, and also in terms of what it implies for global politics. With Joe Biden potentially having an impact on instability in international relations, especially because the partnership between the US and Europe has been a pillar of peace internationally. There was another question by Manuel Carrillo, I think, about the issue of populist leaders and its relationship to the pandemic. The state of exception has been used to deal with it. We have upcoming elections in Ecuador, for example, where Lenin Moreno or Rafael Correa are not participating, and there we have the leadership of a businessman. So we'll see what happens with Ecuador, and especially we have to talk about Peru, where I see a significant leadership in terms of populism. George Forsyth is a leader there. He is a former soccer player, And in November 2020, for example, in Peru, they had 3 presidents in 1 week as a result of a political trial against Vizcarra. So we'll have to keep an eye on Vizcarra. The issue of corruption is deeply impacting democracy, and it's becoming a significant factor. It's interesting to hear what Ricardo said about Israel, because in Asia, there are major elections. It's an important year for the Middle East because we'll have elections in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, hopefully, and also in Palestine. In Palestine, over and over, they have kicked the can when it comes to elections as a result of the lack of reconciliation between the different factions in Palestine, which haven't been able to reach a consensus for elections. So these Israeli elections would be the 4th elections in the last 2 years. They are important, and the objective of Netanyahu is to avoid political impeachment and as a result of abuse of power, and he's using the pandemic as a successful story of the application of the vaccine to stay in power, which would increase his popularity. But there we have an important person in the Nehud party, Gideon Sa'ar, who left the Conservative Party to found his new political group, which is New Hope. So it's interesting to see how they are using the management of the pandemic to stay in power and to stay longer in power, because they broke with the government coalition of the Migrants. So it's interesting. We also have upcoming elections in Hong Kong, where China is doing everything they can to weaken this pro-democratic movement. And we also have European upcoming elections that we have referred to, as well as some other elections in Asia Pacific. But in general terms, this is what we could expect for 2021 elections.
Perfecto, gracias.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Rina. Ricardo, do you have a chance to read the comments or questions by the audience? Go ahead, please. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Rina. Well, the questions revolve around Reina's comments and statements, and I believe that she has addressed most of them. However, there are only 2 that may make reference to several aspects of my presentation, of Monica and Mi's presentation. The first one is this: Latin America has a serious structural problem that has led to its failure when it comes to managing the pandemic. And I'm talking about its broad and omnipresent informal economy. I mean, almost all the countries in Latin America have more people working in the informal sector, in the streets, as opposed to established businesses or formal markets. This disadvantage was seen and approached differently by different governments. What we have, however, as a net balance is that, at least in Mexico and in many other countries, they never implemented the public policies to stay at home. If there is a mistake to highlight in large countries like Mexico, but also in countries like Peru, well, that is that resources were targeted at people who were already identified in poverty or vulnerability censuses, but they never understood. We never understood that what we had to develop was economic policy for those that would become unemployed, which were not those in the list of beneficiaries of vulnerable groups or poor people. In Mexico, that means that they increased efforts to support financially their old clientele, and they neglected productive workers, both formal and informal, which made the lockdown unbearable. That's why the lockdown or lifting of lockdown periods have been so serious in Mexico, Colombia, or Peru. According to the latest studies, the curve of infections in Mexico began to grow significantly again in September, in October, and also after the Mexican independence holidays, when a large mass of people went back to the market with the personal contact. And that has led to the situation we have now, one of the worst moments of the pandemic. The same applies to the good weekend, as they call it in Mexico, which is the equivalent of the Black Friday, where department stores and businesses sell a lot of products. It became a super spreader event, not to mention holidays, Christmas holidays, posadas, which led to this problem. This is something we have to analyze seriously. We still need an economic policy to stay at home, and we do not have one in many countries in Latin America. And finally, I believe that what the country is experiencing is healthy from a democratic standpoint. I'm talking about democracy. I mean, my point is that democracy has not been questioned amid this pandemic. I mean, the only variable is when elections will take place, but they have not been canceled, which is a social, cultural, and strength that we should not overlook. Of course, bodies like the INE should provide evidence and protocols on how to hold elections safely during election days amid this pandemic. We need more protocols. We need more information to society. For example, I would love to hear in the INE's TV spots or ads all these measures having to do with social discipline, and more information about political campaigns for our political rallies, which are at stake. I mean, that's something that must be addressed by electoral authorities. But hey, these are all technical details that the INE has managed to deal with successfully over time. And talking about the other comment, which has to do with social solidarity, I believe that this is not new. We Mexicans love to say that we are supportive, but this is an ongoing social construction. And the same applies to discipline, which includes following measures that are clearly conveyed by health authorities, which means that I believe that many of the countries that we have made reference to here clearly show that countries like Japan, New Zealand, Vietnam, or Taiwan have developed that level of solidarity. They have figured out how to pack into a group of messages mass social behaviors that have been key to contain the pandemic, which I believe is important to highlight. There is not a solidary or supportive Mexican soul that is born with us. I mean, solidarity is a social domestic process that we have not been very good at in this part of the planet. So we still have a long ways to go. But I believe that a good perspective was that of the Argentinian president when they asked him about the tensions between liberties and the pandemic. I believe that he did brilliantly, and it is worth saying or repeating. To exercise freedoms and liberties, you need to be alive, he said. And I believe that this is a large vector that we should not ignore. Thank you, Ricardo. By the way, there was another question in the Q&A on the issue of trust, inter-individual between individuals and institutions. But you made reference to that. The president of the INE wants to say something, and of course, you have the floor, Lorenzo. Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank Rina and Ricardo for their brilliant presentations. I believe that we have fulfilled the purpose of this session. We should not overlook that the organization of elections as part of this recreation of democracy unavoidably occurs in a context. It is not an isolated phenomenon. And I mean, it should be led as part of a much more complex and broader scenario. And from this standpoint, the interventions of both Rina and the interventions of Rina and Ricardo, which have been very wise and accurate, matter. They are complementary. So I believe that for those that have been following electoral phenomena in this forum to understand Mexican elections as elections that are part of a global world where democracy is experiencing common global problems, an increasing number of them is important. The times when we talked about consolidated democracies are behind today. The problems of misinformation or the lack of trust in institutions and the problems of political crisis like Reina has mentioned are common problems.
And we also have the pandemic as in the sense that it poses a challenge for democracies amongst many other facets. It also affects elections. And it also speaks to the fact that how the problems of the world have been truly become globalized. I would like to conclude by thanking once again Rina as well as Ricardo, but above all, I would like to get back to what Ricardo said and taking advantage of this opportunity of what we should do moving forward. The idea of holding these types of seminars is to lay the groundwork so that we can have a series of conversations that we will discuss over many an opportunity. We'll be talking about modern democracies in the future, I'm sure, in the very near future. But for now, what we want to do is prepare the groundwork for our July elections. And so the comment made by Ricardo is something that I think was very important. And I would say the following, and add upon what has already been said by Ricardo and Rina, in the sense that democracies are very resilient vis-a-vis the pandemic, and they're not, I mean, with a few red flags, as Rina mentioned, there have been some authoritarian shows of force being established where they've taken advantage of the pandemic to be more autocratic in the way they handle power, but they're very isolated cases. But there's something else I would add. Our experience internationally and even in Mexico is that people, in the case of elections, far from isolating themselves, are more interested in participating. And that's very interesting. Just to mention what has happened in Mexico. When the INE decided to postpone our local elections for a few months in 2020, we had already managed to gain the acceptance of as many people that were going to be required to help us with setting up our booths, our ballot booths. And so when the pandemic hit, we thought that many of them would go back on their original promise to be able to work with us. But in spite of that, most of the people wanted to participate in it. The people were willing to lend their homes to set up the ballot, the booths rather, the voting booths. A lot of people, in spite of the pandemic, said, yes, I'd be willing to provide you with my front yard so that you can go ahead and set up the booths. And if anything happened, they weren't able to establish them up because they didn't have the necessary safeguards in place in order to protect everybody's health. So I think these are going to be very important elections because citizen participation didn't drop. It continued at the same levels we had previously. And I think that a significant portion or a significant reason for that is because of the health protocols we set up. I think that after 1 year, thanks to the work of organizations such as CAPEL, International IDEA, and so on, we've seen that there are good practices we can follow and ensure that our right to exercise our voting right is still very much in place. And I think that the health protocols in place we'll be seeing very soon will include that we first communicate what it is that we did in previous elections, for example, in the states of Coahuila and Hidalgo. So people understand how everything is going to be done in the fields, how we are going to be training everybody, how the officials, the voting booth officials will be trained to try to reduce close contact as much as possible, and how things can also be handled in a virtual manner. And so we'll be communicating how things will be done. Our offices right now are about to close their doors because, as you know, we have a time or a deadline as to when you can get your voting ID available to you. And we've had 30,000 services being provided on a daily basis. And prior to the pandemic, the number was 60,000. So in spite of the pandemic, we have continued to work. Obviously, we're going to have some very important campaigns, information campaigns in place over the next few months, so we can ensure that people can continue to be willing to vote, ensuring them that they will be protected, that their health will be protected, and that we will be very much involved. And that, for example, everybody will have to wear a face mask when they vote. And if they don't have a face mask, we will be providing them with one. So what I'm trying to say is that we're updating our protocols in light of the current status of the pandemic. And I'm sure that we're going to definitely have a good information campaign in place because, as Rina was saying, we need to be able to build that trust. It's not something that arises spontaneously, and it's not a simple matter. It's a complex situation that involves a lot of stakeholders, and that's why it's so important that we build upon it gradually, and we cannot just wait for things to happen on their own. And I think that this session of the seminar is a good example of how we can provide information to move ahead with that. Once again, thank you very much. I would also like to thank the representatives from the law school, from the UNAM, where I also studied. I would also like to thank Joseph Thompson for his effort as the moderator and our two wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Vean, al cerrar este acto, me queda más que agradecer las excelentes presentaciones. Vean.
I too would also like to thank the wonderful presentations. They were so good that time flew. They were so interesting that time just flew. So thank you once again for the high quality of your presentations and the way in which you made your presentations. It's been a privilege that the organizers have invited me to moderate this event. In all of the forums in which I've participated, I've always said that it's important that we come out of this with more rights and better democracies and not fewer. rights and less democracy,
dicen los italianos.
so that
Que tengan ustedes
we have an opportunity to see each other once again face to face at some point. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias a todos.
Thank you, everybody.
Gracias mil, Rina.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rina.
Oye, está-
Thank you,
Fíjate que yo-
Ricardo.
ahorita Ricardo-
Reunirnos, pero cada uno en su casa.
Sabemos que son tiempos difíciles para ser joven.
Pero también son buenos para participar en las decisiones importantes.
Si cumples 18 antes del 6 de junio de 2021,
Tramita tu INE desde ya.
tienes hasta el 10 de febrero.
Este 2021, contamos todas.
Contamos todos.
INE.